The hall was full of light and music as alien nobles from many worlds gathered under the crystal dome that shimmered like ice above. Them they stood in robes and armor of gold, silver and stone, their voices rising in pride and laughter, but all of them turned when she stepped into the center. Her name was Ishara, the daughter of the High House, the blade of the Velnary throne. Tall and proud, her hair shining like molten metal, and her eyes sharp as lightning, she walked without fear, and smiled, like someone who had never known defeat. Beside her stood the human Jack Moran, a man in plain clothes with calm eyes and a quiet face. The only human ever invited to the sacred court of Velna. Ishara raised her hand, and silence fell. She looked at Jack, and her voice rang out clear and cold, like a bell made of fire. "Guess my true name, human, and I will marry you." The room burst with laughter. The nobles clapped and howled with joy. They thought it was a joke, a game, a show of pride and mockery. For names had power on Velnar. The true name of a soul was guarded from birth, known only by the gods and one's own blood. To speak it without permission was a breach of spirit, and to guess it was thought impossible. Jack said nothing at first, just looked at her. Then slowly he smiled, not wide, not proud, but like someone who had already seen the end of the story, and found it worth the journey. Ishara's smile twitched as if something about his silence unsettled her. She laughed again, louder, sharper. "He will need centuries," she said to the crowd, and turned away, but Jack's eyes stayed on her. "I accept," he said, and the court fell silent. The music died, the dancers froze, even the lights above seemed to grow dimmer. The nobles stared, unsure if they had heard right. The high priest stepped forward, his face grave and old. "Do you know what you ask, human?" he said. "Ishara's true name is sacred to the stars. It is not written, it is not spoken." Jack nodded. "I know then." The priest looked at Ishara, and she shrugged, amused. "Fine," she said. "He has 3 sun cycles. If he speaks my name, I am his. But when he fails, he leaves this world and never returns." The bet was made, and the stars above the dome seemed to flicker as if something far beyond had heard it, and waited. Ishara returned to her throne, where she sat like a queen carved from starlight, her fingers tapping her chin, her thoughts dancing faster than the music that started again. Jack walked away from the center slowly, with the eyes of many burning into his back. The nobles whispered and laughed, already planning their victory feast, but one figure did not laugh. The high priest watched Jack go, his old eyes filled with something darker than worry, something like fear. Outside the court, Jack stepped into the soft wind of the Velnary night. The towers around him reached like fingers into the sky, glowing with pale green light. The air smelled of strange flowers and sharp metal, but he did not notice. He walked in silence, his thoughts deep and far, his steps steady, as if the ground itself knew where he was going. Behind him, hidden in the shadows, Ishara watched from a high balcony, her gaze cold and sharp, like a blade drawn in secret. She watched as Jack knelt to help a small alien child who had dropped her food. She watched as he gave the child his last ration bar, and ruffled her head gently. Before moving on, she frowned, not because of what he did, but because it felt like something familiar, something buried back in her chamber. Ishara stood before her mirror, her armor now off her hair, loose, her face still and quiet like still water. "He will fail," she told herself. "No outsider can ever guess a name like mine, not even one who listens, not even one who cares." But in her chest, something small and quiet stirred. Something she had not felt since she was a girl. It felt like the breath before a storm, and she did not know if it was fear or hope. That night the stars above Velnar did not shine as they usually did. They flickered, they pulsed, they moved as if they too were waiting, as if they too had heard the bet, and held their breath for the name that could shake the silence of a soul, the name that might bind to fates forever, or break them both without mercy. And so it began, the bet that made the stars hold their breath, and across the galaxy, those who watched from shadows and secrets knew that something had shifted. Something small, quiet, and unstoppable had begun to stir in the heart of a human, and the soul of an alien princess, who laughed too loud and looked away too quickly. Jack walked through the wide streets of the alien capital, his boots soft on the glowing stone that pulsed with ancient energy. The towers around him shimmered like glass and gold, reaching so high they seemed to vanish into the clouds. Above, everything around him felt alive. The air carried the scent of flowers that only opened at night, their petals humming softly with light. But Jack was not looking up. He walked with a quiet mind, eyes watching, ears open, heart listening. He did not ask questions out loud. He waited for the world to speak first. At the temple square, he saw a mural carved into a wall, taller than 10 men. It showed a woman holding a burning star in one hand, and covering her face with the other, her eyes hidden, her mouth closed. Beneath it was a poem written in the alien tongue. He could not read it, but he felt the sadness in the shapes of the lines, as if the words themselves had weight behind him. An old alien swept the stones with a soft broom, each stroke slow and careful. Jack greeted him with a nod, and sat nearby without speaking. The old one glanced at him once, then looked back at his work. As the night wind passed, Jack asked in a gentle voice, "What does the mural say?" The old one did not answer right away. He finished sweeping one more row, then leaned on his broom, and spoke like dust. "It means she was born with a name of fire, but to keep her world from burning she gave it up." Jack nodded, and whispered, "Thank you." The old one smiled and said, "You chase a name like chasing the wind. It will not come if you rush it." Jack stood and bowed before walking on, his thoughts heavy. He walked to the edge of the city where the stone turned to soft earth, and the towers faded into broken ruins. No guards followed him, no nobles watched him here. He was alone with the bones of a forgotten age. In the silence he heard the soft hum of something beneath the dirt like a heartbeat. He knelt, and placed his palm on the ground, and felt the pulse stronger than before. He dug with his hands, pushing aside dirt and roots until his fingers touched stone smooth and cold. It was a piece of an old structure, half buried, broken and covered in moss. He cleared it, and found markings, lines like vines and stars twisted together, in a shape that made his skin crawl, not from fear, but from knowing he had seen this shape before in Ashara's necklace. The one she never removed, the one that glowed faintly when she was angry or lost in thought. As he traced the shape, the air around him shifted. The night grew still. The wind stopped, even the humming flowers held their breath. A soft voice echoed around him, not in words but in feeling. It said, "Listen, not with ears but with heart." The stone beneath his hand grew warm, and the markings pulsed like a quiet whisper, calling not to his mind, but to something deeper. He closed his eyes and saw a memory. Not his own, a child running through a field of silver grass, a voice calling her name. Not Ishara, not princess, not warrior, but something softer, something forgotten. The child laughed and turned, but her face was blurry. The memory faded like smoke. Jack opened his eyes, the stone now cold again. The wind returned, brushing dust across the ruins. He stood and looked toward the heart of the city, where the great spire of the court rose like a dagger against the stars. He knew the name was there, hidden not in books or records, but in pain and memory and silence. He walked back as dawn touched the sky with soft gold. The streets now quiet, nobles asleep, the priests in prayer, the city unaware that something had changed, that someone had heard a voice buried for ages. In a high tower, Ishara sat alone, watching the sky, her armor beside her, her hair unbound, her fingers tracing the edge of her pendant. She had not slept, not because of fear, but because of something else. She had watched the human wander. She had watched him speak to those no one spoke to. She had watched him kneel in the dirt with no shame, and stand with quiet fire in his eyes. She felt her heart beat faster, not from danger but from something she did not name. She whispered to herself, "He will fail." She whispered again, "He must fail." But her voice shook, and her hands trembled, and deep inside, where no one could see, she feared he might not. She stood and turned from the window, but not before one final glance toward the ruins where the wind still whispered, and the dust still held secrets, and the name she buried so long ago waited like a flame in the dark. The rain fell soft and slow over the rooftops of the ancient city, turning light into shimmer and silence into song. Jack stood at the edge of a broken archway deep beneath the temple ruins. The air was thick with dust and memory. The stones around him still glowed faintly from the markings he had uncovered before. He had not returned with tools or light. He came with silence and trust. He placed his hand once more on the smooth surface, and waited. No whisper came this time, no voice, no vision. But he was not disappointed. He closed his eyes and sat on the cold ground, letting the weight of the place settle into his bones. Above the chamber, hidden by time, was a narrow tunnel carved with words older than the kingdom itself. Some of them had crumbled away, but others remained etched with care. One line caught his eye, though he could not read the language. He drew it in his notebook and walked back into the city. The people moved around him without notice, nobles in fine robes, merchants calling out soft songs, and children chasing glowing birds. But he saw none of it. His mind was lost in thought. He reached the scroll house, where records from thousands of years were stored, not on screens, but on carved crystal and pressed silk. The keeper was a quiet creature with 7 eyes, and skin like tree bark. It greeted him with a soft nod and opened a narrow drawer. From deep inside it pulled a folded cloth with old ink marks. Jack spread it out, and compared the symbols one by one, until he found it. The line from the tunnel translated to, "She once walked among us, with a name full of sorrow. Now she walks above us, without it." He stared at the words, feeling a strange pressure in his chest, as if his heart had paused to listen. He left the scroll house, and walked toward the market, where music played and alien laughter rang through the air, but his steps slowed as he saw a shadow waiting in the corner. Ishara, cloaked in dark blue, stood with arms crossed, her eyes unreadable. She stepped into his path and said, "You look tired." Human Jack nodded. "I have been walking through your past." She raised an eyebrow. "My past is not for your feet," she said sharply. Jack took out the drawing of the symbol and held it out. She looked at it for a long time, her face still, her fingers clenched slowly. "Where did you find this?" Her voice was low, softer than before. "Beneath the old temple." He said, "No gods, no force, no tricks, just dust and silence." She looked away for a moment, then back at him. "You should not go there again. You are not ready for what lies buried." "Then tell me," he said, not with pride, not with challenge, but with something like care. She stepped closer, her voice now a whisper. "Do you think a name is just sound? Do you think it is something you can own?" "No," he said, "but I think it is something you miss, something you buried because it hurt." And she froze, not from fear, not from anger, but because for one breath she remembered. A memory returned sharp and sudden. A field of soft vines, a small girl running with joy, her name called out by a gentle voice. A name that wrapped around her like warmth. Then came fire and shadows and silence, and the vow she made to never speak it again, to never let anyone hold it, to never be that girl again. She turned away and said, "Leave this place, stop chasing ghosts." Jack did not move. Instead, he said softly, "I think your name is not a weapon, it is a story, and maybe someone should hear it, even if just once." She vanished into the crowd like wind slipping between cracks, and Jack stood alone, holding the drawing in one hand, and a new fear in his heart, for he was no longer chasing a mystery, he was chasing pain, and that was not something to win or lose, but something to hold. With care that night, he sat in his small room, and stared at the stars above the city, each one pulsing with slow breath, like the heart of a giant. He did not write or sleep, he only whispered names, old and new, strange and soft, hoping one would feel right, but none did not yet. In the shadows of her chamber, Ishara held the pendant tight, her fingers shaking, her eyes wet. She whispered her true name once into the silence, and it sounded like a wound, trying to heal, and the stars outside seemed to pulse with gentle light, as if they heard it too, and remembered. The training hall echoed with sharp clangs, as warriors struck metal against metal, fire in their eyes, and sweat on their brows, but all paused when Ishara stepped in. Her presence was a storm that silenced pride. Her armor glinted with the mark of the royal crest, and her blade was known across 100 worlds, yet her mind was not in the fight today. Her steps were heavy, her thoughts far away. The human had seen too much. He had spoken words that were never meant to be spoken, and something inside her would not stop shaking. Jack stood outside, the hall calm and quiet as always, waiting like the rain waits behind the clouds. When Ishara saw him, her heart clenched. She walked straight to him, eyes locked, jaw set. He opened his mouth to speak, but she drew her sword and pointed it at his chest. Her voice was low and cold. "Stop digging," she said, her hand steady, though her breath was not. "This is not a game anymore." Jack looked at the blade, then at her eyes, then said without fear, "Then why are you shaking?" Her hand twitched just once, but she did not lower her sword. Instead she said, "You have no idea what you are walking into. The past is not a path for you to follow. It is fire, it is ruin." Jack said softly, "Maybe that is why it needs someone who can walk through fire." Ishara's lips curled with anger, but also with confusion. No one had ever challenged her like this, not with swords, but with words that slipped past her walls. She turned and walked away, fast and fierce, hoping the sound of her steps would drown out her thoughts, but they did not. The sound of his voice stayed with her like a song. She could not forget. Behind her, Jack followed, not close, not far, just enough to let her know he would not give up. She led him to the far edge of the palace, where the wind howled, and the towers thinned, the stars above clearer than ever. There in the quiet stood an old shrine, broken and blackened by war, its doors sealed with chains. Ishara stopped before it, her voice a whisper. "This was once my home, before the palace, before the throne. I was born here, my name was first spoken here." She reached out and touched the stone with care and pain in her eyes. "But I buried that name when the flames came, when my family fell, and I rose with a new name carved in rage and duty." Jack stood beside her now, no longer chasing, just listening. He asked, "What was it like the moment you chose to forget?" Her voice shook. "It was like holding a flower and watching it turn to ash." She closed her eyes and said, "I was 12 when the invaders came. I watched them take everything I had. My mother screamed, my father bled, and the name they called me became a curse. I threw it away and swore no one would ever speak it again, not even me." He took out the pendant he had found and held it toward her. Eyes widened and her breath caught. "How did you get this?" He told her of the caretaker deep in the ruins, the one who had not spoken in years, until he gave Jack this gift. She reached for it slowly, but her hand stopped in mid-air. Trembling, she whispered, "This Was my mother's. She wore it the day we burned. I thought it lost. Jack placed it gently into her hand. Her fingers closed around it, and she fell to her knees, not from weakness, but from the weight of memory. She did not cry, but her face told stories. Too deep for tears, her voice broke like thin glass. I do not want to remember. I do not want to be that girl. Again Jack knelt beside her and said, maybe you do not have to be just her, or just this. You can be both strong and soft, brave and broken. You can be all of it and still rise. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in years there was no fire. In them only storm and silence, and something new. The wind picked up as if carrying away the old pain. The shrine behind them seemed to sigh as dust lifted from its walls, and the stars above shimmered a little brighter. Ishara stood slowly, holding the pendant close. She looked at Jack and said, if you say the name, I think you will. It will not be a victory, it will be a promise, and promises are not made lightly. Jack nodded, his voice calm and true. I am not here to win, I am here to understand. Ishara smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes, and for the first time since the bet began, she feared not the name, but what it might bring back. The sky above the capital turned deep red as the twin moons rose, and the hour of the final gathering came. The court shimmered with golden light, and the nobles filled the great dome once more. Their laughter louder, their robes brighter, their eyes full of pride. They were ready to watch the human fail, ready to see the end of a foolish challenge. Jack stood at the center of it all, calm and still, his face unreadable, his hands at his sides. He wore no armor, no jewels, only a simple cloak of dark gray that moved gently with the breeze. Ishara sat high on her throne, silent and unreadable, her armor polished to a mirror, her crown low over her brow, the pendant hidden beneath the metal plates, her eyes locked on Jack, her heart silent but heavy. The high priest raised his staff and spoke the words of the old rite. Today the final guess will be made. The human will speak. If he is right, the vow is sealed. If he is wrong, he shall leave this world forever, never to return. The crowd leaned forward. Eager whispers rose. Like smoke, Jack looked at no one, his eyes closed, as if listening to something far away, something only he could hear. Then he opened them and stepped forward, his voice soft but clear. He said, I do not speak this name to win. I speak it to return something you lost, something you buried, not because it was weak, but because it was too strong for the world that hurt you. Ishara shifted in her seat, her fingers curling slowly around the edge of her throne. The room grew colder, as if the stars outside paused to listen. Jack took a breath and said the name Shalitha. The sound cut through the silence like wind through glass, light and sharp and full of something deeper than any title or crown. No one spoke, not even the priest. The nobles froze, the music died, the air held still, even the lights above flickered, as if unsure whether to shine. Ishara sat motionless, her lips parted, her eyes wide, her chest rising slow, then faster, then faster. The name echoed in her mind, wrapped around her heart and pulled her back into memories she had locked away. She saw her mother call her from the garden, saw herself run with laughter through silver grass, saw the warmth of hands that held her, and the moment those hands turned cold and still, she had screamed that name over their bodies, before silence had claimed her, before her voice had turned into iron, and her name into myth. Now it had returned, not as a weapon but as a whisper of healing. She stood slowly, every eye on her, every breath in the room held. She walked down the steps of the throne, her armor heavy, her steps light, her face unreadable. Jack did not move, he did not smile, he only waited. When she reached him, she looked into his eyes and whispered, where did you hear that name? He said, I listened, I searched, and someone who loved you once helped me remember it. She looked at the pendant, now resting over her chest, and then back at him and said, you have no right to speak it, not without carrying what it means. Then, she placed her hand over his heart and whispered, but maybe you already do. The high priest stepped forward with shaking hands and said, by the old laws the name was true, the vow is real, the bet is fulfilled. Jack is now bound to the royal line. If the lady chooses to accept him. The court erupted into noise, some shocked, some angry, some laughing nervously, but none dared interrupt what happened. Next, Ishara leaned in and said softly, I do not marry you because of a name, I marry you because you saw the part of me I feared most and still stayed. Jack nodded once and said, I would have stayed even without the vow. She turned to face the court and raised her hand. Silence fell again. Her voice rang clear. This name is not a chain. It is a bridge, and this man crossed it when no one else dared. Let the record show. He did not take my name. He gave it back to me, and for that I choose him. The stars above flared bright, as if blessing the vow, and the wind that passed through the dome felt like a sigh of something old and sacred. Waking once more, Jack looked up at Ishara and saw her not as a princess, not as a warrior, but as the girl who had once run through the fields, and he knew that from this moment nothing would be The same again, the sky over Velna had never looked so clear. The stars above shimmered like soft embers in a sea of black velvet, and the moons drifted like slow-moving guardians watching in silence from far above inside the royal chambers. Jack sat alone, not in chains, not under guard, but waiting by choice. The celebration outside echoed with strange music and laughter, but none of it reached his heart. He had spoken the name, and the name had been real, and now he waited for a choice that was not his to make. Footsteps approached, soft and slow each step, like a heartbeat of something ancient. The doors opened, not with trumpets, not with command, but with quiet grace. Ishara stood there, cloaked in white and silver, without her armor, without her crown, without the mask of command. Her eyes held no fire, no storm, only the calm of someone who had faced herself and lived. Jack stood as she entered, his voice low and steady. "I did not expect to see you so soon." She stepped closer, the room warm with candlelight, her face unreadable, but her eyes soft. "I told them I needed time, but they all waited for me to make a decision. One they thought was about duty or politics, but this is not about any of that." She sat beside him and placed the pendant on the table between them, the symbol glowing faintly in the light. He looked at it, then at her, and said, "You never had to honor the vow." "I know," she nodded slowly. "I could have called it a trick, a guess, a game, but I didn't, because it was none of those. You spoke my name not with pride, not with hunger, but with care, and I felt it in my bones like a door I had locked, breaking open." Jack reached for her hand, not with force, not with fear, just with understanding, and she let him. She whispered, "I have not heard that name in so long that it felt like a dream, a ghost, a wound, but when you said it, it felt real again. Not painful, but whole," he said. "Then let it be yours again. Not just a shadow, not just a secret, but something you can carry without fear." Ishara closed her eyes and leaned her head on his shoulder. For a long moment, they sat in silence. No court, no war, no world, only two people holding something fragile and strong, the way stars hold fire without burning out. She said, "I used to believe that names were chains, that they held us to pasts we could not change. But now, I think maybe they're roots, and roots can grow again if we let them." Jack smiled and said, "Maybe that is why I came. Not to win, not to prove anything, but to give something back, something no one else believed mattered anymore." She looked at him and asked, "Then what do you want now that the it has been spoken, and the vow offered?" He answered, "Not marriage, not title, not glory. I just want you to know that someone saw you and did not look away." She laughed, a soft sound full of breath and light, and said, "Then you may have something better than the throne. You may have my trust, and trust on Velner is worth more than any crown, more than any title, more than any title, more than any vow." She stood and took his hand, guiding him toward the window. The city lights below flickered like stars born on the ground. The sky above painted with endless depth. She said, "Do you see that star there? The one with the red edge? That was the star I used to wish upon when I was a child. I would look at it and whisper my name, hoping it would remember me if I ever forgot. And now that same star watches as I say it again, not to the sky, but to you." Jack looked up at the star, and then at her, and said, "I will never forget it, not as long as I breathe." She turned to him and smiled, and said, "Then, we begin something new, not because we must, but because we choose to let our story be written in starlight, and silence, in memory, and meaning, in hope, and in healing." The wind outside picked up, and carried with it the scent of flowers that only bloomed when truth was spoken. The city below kept dancing, but high above, in that quiet chamber, two souls rested, not as strangers, not as ruler and guest, but as equals, bound by something stronger than law, and deeper than fate, a promise not made with rings or thrones, but etched in the quiet space between one name and another. The wind over the silver dunes of Haveth sang like an old song remembered after years of silence, soft and slow, and full of warmth. Beneath a sky painted with endless stars, a ship landed, gentle and quiet, its lights dimmed to match the soft glow of the night. From the open ramp stepped a figure cloaked in gray. His boots touched the sand like he had walked there before, like he belonged to the dust and stars around him. His name was still Jack, but now the galaxies whispered it with respect. Behind him came Ishara, not with crown or guards or blades, but with her hand in his. Their steps were slow, their breaths matched their hearts, calm and sure. It had been many cycles since that night in the court, many worlds since that vow had been spoken, but the promise had never faded. It had only grown with each step they took together. They had not married in the way the nobles had wanted, no golden ceremony, no grand speech, no chains of law. Instead, they had built their bond through action, through trust, through quiet moments shared beneath alien suns, where only they could hear each other breathe, and know that they were not alone in every city they visited. Some called her the warrior queen, others the broken flame, some still feared the power of her name, but Jack only called her Shalitha. When the stars were quiet and her armor rested at her side, he would whisper it with care, and she would always smile, not because of what the name meant long ago, but because of what it had become. In his voice tonight they had come to Haveth, not for war, not for politics, but for peace. A village near the dunes had called for help. Their wells were dry, their crops weak, and the storms growing stronger. Jack had answered not with soldiers, but with tools and blueprints. He showed them how to pull water from the deep stone, how to shape wind towers with scraps, how to read the land like a friend, not a foe. The children of the village laughed around him, chasing sparks from the small generator he had fixed, and Ashara watched them, her eyes full of something softer than pride, something older than power, a memory of laughter in fields long gone, and now returned. An elder approached her, his skin marked with the lines of time and sand, and said softly, "You walk with a human who knows true names, and yet your eyes show no fear." She answered, with a gentle nod, and said, "He is the only one who ever asked to see me, not just my blade, not just my title, but the part of me I forgot how to carry, and now I carry it again, because he holds it with me, not for me that night, the stars above." Haveth seemed closer than before. The fire crackled, and the people of the village sang songs in languages Jack did not know, but felt deep in his bones. Ishara sat beside him, her hair loose, her eyes reflecting the fire. He leaned closer and whispered a word only she could hear, and she laughed, not loud, not sharp, but warm and free, and leaned her head on his shoulder. Young girl ran up to them, her eyes wide, and asked Lady Ishara, "Why does he call you that name? It sounds different from the one they use in the stories." Ishara looked down at the girl and said softly, "Because that name is mine and his alone. It is not for war, not for courts. It is for the space between heartbeats where truth lives." The girl nodded, though she did not fully understand, and skipped away singing to the stars. Jack looked at Ishara and asked, "Do you regret it? The name, the vow, the path?" She shook her head slow and sure. "Never. The name was a key, not a chain, and you were the only one who ever knocked on the door before opening it." He smiled and said, "And you were the only one who ever let me in without asking me to change." They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, not moving, just breathing, as the fire faded and the stars grew brighter above them. A quiet passed between them, not empty, but full of everything they had shared, and everything they still hoped to build in the years that followed. Stories of them spread across the stars, not as legends, not as rulers, but as two beings who had walked through pain and chosen not to close the door behind them, but to leave it open for others to follow. And behind every tale was a name once lost, once feared, now spoken in love by a single voice in the quiet of the night. And when Jack spoke that name, she would always turn with a smile, not because it was a command, not because it was sacred, but because it was hers and his and theirs.